Hello, and welcome back to the offices of the Game Detectives.
Last season, we did an in-depth investigation of rare platforming titles. This time around, we're going to be taking a different type of case and analyzing another platformer of the era, Ratchet and Clank. Here are the cold, hard facts. Ratchet and Clank was published in 2002 by Insomniac Games, the same company that produced the Spyro series. However, for this new IP, the company decided to take a more teen-oriented approach. Insomniac set Ratchet and Clank in space, and included much more action involving various weapons, with only a few true platforming sections. The emphasis on action over platforming garnered a T rating from the ESRB, and many teenagers who grew up with rare platformers loved the updated approach.
But we've seen this before. Newer isn't always better. However, Ratchet and Clank drastically altered the platformer with its own takes on the tropes of the genre. Surprisingly, Ratchet and Clank holds up well against the other games of the time because of its ability to build its world and incorporate the core ideas and motifs of the game into every single action, setting, and character of the world.
The most notable difference between Ratchet and Clank and other platformers is the art direction the game has. Insomniac decided to include more grays, browns, and blacks in its worlds to distance the game from accusations of a juvenile design that many other platformers at the time had. They also decided to place the game's setting in space, allowing the designers to include more aliens, spaceships, hazardous materials, and weapons into the design of the game. Space was a notable setting change from the different platformers of the time, which tended to focus on more natural occurring phenomena, such as snow, grass, or water. In a time where the norm was colorful, bouncy fantasy graphics, it goes for darker, more industrial visuals.
Also, Ratchet & Clank prioritizes combat more than its predecessors. While you do fight enemies in, say, Banjo-Tooie or Glover, you never truly focus on just those enemies, besides the occasional Jiggy or boss battle. In Ratchet & Clank, you tend to spend the majority of your time fighting waves of enemies as you progress through a level, rather than navigating a complex 3D world as you would with other platformers. In fact, Ratchet & Clank sometimes feels like an amalgamation of different genres, from shooters to platformers to action to adventures. Gameplay like this could have gotten mixed up in less capable hands, but Insomniac expertly crafts a weapon system that seamlessly integrates both into the action and the platforming sections of the world.
One of the biggest complaints about platformers are their fixation on collecting as many collectibles as collectively possible. But Ratchet & Clank only treats one object, bolts, as a true collectible. You trade in bolts for weapons, linking the action and platforming aspects and helping the flow of the game. The only thing you have to worry about collecting are bolts, which come from breaking boxes littered throughout the planets and defeating the numerous enemies that stand in your way. Gathering bolts is so easy and fluid in the game that it soon doesn't even cross your mind that you have to find them. It's just second nature when you get a few levels in. You see some boxes, you smash them, and you get bolts. Simple. No need to go far out of your way to get them. The use of bolts in the game also follows the escalating difficulty. As you beat harder enemies, you get more bolts, giving you an incentive to try to beat as many of those baddies as possible. Collecting bolts also feels extra rewarding, because of the sound effects and almost magnetizing way they flow towards you. This is heavily borrowed from collecting gems in Spyro, but works perfectly here as well.
There are rarely any times that you will run flat out of bolts or not have enough to continue onward, unless you spend an unnecessary amount of bolts on ammo. Ratchet & Clank uses bolts to great effect by making them plentiful enough to keep you progressing through the game without making you spend an enormous amount of time hunting for them. There's no need to collect every single one, like you would with Jiggies or other collectibles of the era.
The only problem with using bolts as collectibles is the rather small pickup distance in the game. For nearly the entire game, you have to be extremely close to these bolts to pick them up. And sure, you do eventually get the bolt grabber, which lets you draw in bolts from extremely large distances, but the short pickup distance in the beginning and middle of the game makes collecting bolts tedious at times. It disrupts the flow of the game and makes you spend more time standing still or combing back through the same area twice to make sure you got all the bolts. While it might seem like a small problem, this may actually slow down your progress a lot.
Some people do consider the weapons of the game to be collectibles as well, but the weapons are much more useful and necessary to the game than a single collectible. Most importantly, these weapons offer players a choice as to how they want to go through defeating the game. The game offers an extremely diverse array of weapons that can alter how you go about defeating enemies based on the characteristics of each weapon. For example, on planet Oxron, small flies go around waking up large spider enemies if you get close, but simply blasting these flies from afar with one small shot of the blaster takes them out. Then you can target the harder spider enemies with a heftier weapon like the Destroyer without fear of waking them up if you get too close.
But that's just one way of going about defeating these enemies. You could choose to use no weapons and do a more one-on-one combat, or you could choose to focus on bombs and projectiles, or you could just spam the decoy gun. It's completely up to you, which adds a unique spin on attacking in the platformer genre. In most situations, no particular weapon has a clear advantage. This allows for different playstyles and preferences. If you want, you can get through the entire game with the basic combustor if that's how you choose, but it's more fun to mix it up with the various weapons.
Of course, the game wants you to get all the weapons, and doing so will make the game easier, and there are certain points where you do need specific weapons to break down tough barriers. But you can choose to save up your bolts for a more expensive item, and skip some of the middle ones if you feel like they aren't your style. Even though there are a ridiculous amount of weapons, and the quick select only lets you select 8 at a time, you can choose the way you want to fight your enemies. Some of the greatest joys in the game occur when you experiment with the various weapons and see what kills enemies best. It also helps that ammo is extremely plentiful and easy to come by.
The gadgets also offer a unique spin on the platforming genre. My favorite one is the Trespasser, which allows you to break into doors by completing quick but enjoyable laser-based puzzles. The Slingshot also opens up fun sections in which you fly from one bar to the next. And the Hydro Displacer offers some unique, albeit easy, water puzzles as well. The Hologuise, which lets you parade around as an evil robot to trick enemies into thinking you are on their side, offers the most unique puzzles, in which you have to figure out exactly where you can place yourself in order to defeat all of the enemies before they have the chance to hit alarms.
The Clank upgrades are pretty fun too, but have mixed results. At different points in the game, you can upgrade Clank for a price of 2,000 bolts. First, he receives a heli pack, which lets you use propellers to glide and jump higher. But the best upgrade is the Hydro pack, which allows you to swim fast and navigate fun and challenging obstacle courses, racing against the clock to make it through underwater caves before you become electrified.
The worst Clank upgrade is the Jetpack, which adds nothing to your flight or jump distance, but gives you a ground pound move, which could have just as easily been included with the Helipack. You also do get a hover function, but it doesn't have much utility in the game. You can't float over hazardous ground with it, and every gap in the game can be jumped over easily without it, so it seems like there's really no real reason to even include this upgrade.
The different shoes you get in the game also add much needed variety to the gameplay. The Magna Boots give you access to magnetic walkways that can scale up walls or even flip you completely upside down. The camera interacts nicely with these sections, making it easy to navigate, but if you accidentally make a false move, you fall off, making it feel like your own fault you died, rather than the game's fault for having a bad camera. But in these sections, you cannot use any weapons, which makes no real sense in the world the game is built.
The grind boots allow access to entertaining rail areas, which require you to jump between rails, avoid enemies and bombs, and sometimes even activate switches to access new areas. These sections are fluid, fast, and most importantly scarce enough that every time you encounter a rail section, it acts as a quick but simple derailment from the game. Again, it adds variety to the game and offers a respite from the constant attacking and defending you do in the game.
The various sections in which you controlled spaceships were entertaining. Players can easily control the ships and shoot at the same time with the fluid motion. The sections in which you had to shoot down ships were just challenging enough, where you had to use your skills to finish the section without dying, but not so challenging where you had to really be nervous about having to redo the whole section.
Overall, Ratchet and Clank just has a great variety of gameplay. You can control ships, turrets, skate, navigate swiftly on land and in water, crush everything as Giant Clank, and ride the rails. And they all fit in the settings and actually control very well. Rather than focusing on one type of gameplay, the game tries its hand at a bunch of different types of gameplay, all to great success. Unlike the horrid minigames in other platformers, Rextro, Ratchet and Clank obviously put time and energy into every single portion of the game, making sure they actually worked properly.
Well, besides the hoverboarding sections, hoverboarding was a good idea, but it had poor execution. It's very similar to the spaceship sections, or grinding the rails, in that it varies the gameplay and adds some interest to the world, but the controls in the hoverboard sections are the worst in the game. It sometimes lags behind input, which none of the other sections do. When the rest of your game controls almost seamlessly, the lack of responsive gameplay sticks out like a sore thumb.
Also, the structures of the racing courses don't make much sense. The number of hazards on the field in the first race seems unnecessary, and makes the race much more difficult than it actually needs to be. And really, the second race is almost easier, since the shortcut you have to take is clearly visible, and you don't have to hit every single speed up like you do in the first one. Plus, it adds missiles, which is actually pretty fun. Dare I say, the game could have benefited from several smaller races that logically scaffolded the difficulty each time. Or they could have started by having you complete a time trial, and then re-race enemies. I'm not sure how they could have successfully built the difficulty level up, but having two races with different difficulties just doesn't make much sense.
One great part about the hoverboarding sections, and really the game in general, is the music. Ratchet and Clank chooses to go somewhere completely different with its worlds, so it makes a lot of sense that the music would change along with it. It takes inspiration from a lot of different sources: techno, house, movie soundtracks, and the traditional platforming video game music of the time.
It still is very much video game music, with fun repetitive phrases and different instrumentations covering the same theme on loop. But the game successfully distinguishes its music from other platformers because it forgoes the theatrics of other games like Banjo-Kazooie. The music is far more subdued, and gives an air of mystery and upbeat adventure action. It somehow manages to be fun to listen to, while also having a foreboding theme behind it. It's the perfect complement to a futuristic and industrial game.
Unfortunately, the various characters in the game aren't quite as memorable as the music. First, we'll start with the main characters. Even though Ratchet is supposed to be a little more sassy than his other platforming counterparts, he often comes across as a whiny jerk. Well, he eventually realizes that he should be saving the world instead of just getting revenge on Captain Quark. He still comes off as unnervingly childish and self-centered. And I don't think that's what the game developers were going for. But it was really fun when he tried to be a spokesperson and failed at it. He is much moodier than his platforming counterparts, but it feels like a fake edginess that doesn't make logical sense based off the events of the game.
Clank comes off far better, because he actually is a caring individual who wants what is best for the galaxy. While he might not be as realistic, he's a much more enjoyable character, showing more personality and quirk than his counterpart. He's not a dynamic character by any means, but he at least maintains a composure and personality throughout the story, rather than changing emotions and motivations on a dime like Ratchet. The voice actors try their best to bring levity and life to both Ratchet and Clank, but it is kinda hard when they are so one-dimensional.
Part of the reason that Ratchet and Clank may not work so well is that the humor in the game isn't that funny, and the main characters have to deliver most of the jokes. While making Quark an inept fool is an inspired choice, most of the characters don't have the comedic qualities that work with these jokes. Even though the game has a T rating, it is mostly juvenile humor with a reliance on sight gags and silly puns. While it might be funny for the kids in the group, it doesn't make the game much more fun for the older players. I think a little less funny than Powerpuff Girls, and a little funnier than Johnny Test. But the various non-playable characters in the game are similarly uninteresting, and far from engaging. Besides the strange Russian woman who appears for no reason, none of the NPCs are that memorable. And even though the voice actors give them distinct voices, they simply don't do enough in the game to be noteworthy. Drek and Quark are a fun odd couple to have as the main villains of the game, but every other character is boring.
Similarly, the various bosses in the game have mixed results. Alien Queen, the first boss in the game, fails to stick out because she looks like a larger version of other enemies, and wasn't all that interesting in concept or design. She has basic attacks, calls smaller enemies to attack for her, and has no kind of pomp or circumstance around her fight. She was also so easy to defeat that It just felt like fighting another basic enemy rather than a boss.
The Blargian Snagglebeast felt much more like a standard boss, and it could have even been the first boss in the game given how easy it was to dispatch once you figured out its main weakness. I did like how the game didn't explicitly tell you to lead the beast over to the bridges, but it was pretty obvious. Overall, it was a completely standard boss fight and an alright one. Nothing to really complain about, but nothing to commend.
The fight with Captain Quark's ship was fun, and the only boss fight in which you compete using a spaceship, giving you a heightened atmosphere. Again, the boss fight is fun, but overly simple. All you had to do was destroy the 6 parts of his ship, and then Quark would be defeated. Much like the Snagglebeast, it served its purpose, but wasn't especially difficult. The only reason it is really notable is that it used the spaceship.
Ultimate Supreme Executive Chairman Drek is the best fight in the game. You get to beat him up with Giant Clank, and then you have to use your weapons in combination with your platforming abilities to dodge and shoot and take him out. You could use a variety of different weapons to defeat him, such as the blaster, the bombs, the destroyer, and the rhino, or the Tesla Claw. There's no one way to defeat him. Rather, you choose how you want to go forward. Grinding the rail while avoiding attacks during the final phase was especially enjoyable. The only complaint is the platforming between sections. If you fall for some weird reason, you have to start the boss fight completely over again. Not cool.
The only other negative of Ratchet and Clank is the hardware limits of the era, something we can't directly blame the game for. Unfortunately, due to hardware, if you die somewhere, you may have to respawn a large distance away from where you died. This long distance might have been okay if the game had solely focused on either combat or platforming. But in longer levels, some of the platforming sections include bottomless pits and small platforms, meaning that a simple slip in the platforming section will make you redo that entire section, enemies included, with the lower amount of ammo you had when you died. The only good thing about this is that you can farm more bolts this way. While it's not Insomniac's direct fault, they could have adjusted their game slightly to focus less on platforming and more on combat.
We also need to point out the linear level design of the game. While some gamers may dislike this design, it actually works pretty well, as most of the levels have a distinct reason for getting simply from point A to point B, most of the time finding infobots to bring you to the next world. There are multiple areas in each world which aren't necessary to completing the game, and the addition of the gold bolts adds just enough variety in the worlds that the planets have plenty to discover and experiment with along the way.
Overall, Ratchet and Clank was really successful in establishing itself from the competitors of the era. It is the platformer updated for teens, as its ESRB rating suggests. It focuses more on combat than platforming, but still uses collectibles in a unique and smart way that fits in with the world in which it inhabits. It's a great game at the start of the PS2 era, which somehow manages to subvert the tropes of the platforming genre while feeling fresh and new. It doesn't feel like a response to another game, or that it's based on another game. Rather, Ratchet and Clank establishes its own identity.
So that was our investigation of Ratchet and Clank. Did we miss any evidence? What do you think of Ratchet and Clank?
Make your case down in the comments.